per episode. So, you know, take your notes. Are we ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So chapter 1 is Telemachus. Stephen wakes up. Buck Mulligan shaves, and Stephen confronts a ghost of his mother. We're set up for the rest of the day. Chapter 2 is Nestor. Stephen is the worst teacher ever. Doesn't notice the kid cheating in front of him, who's reciting a book from in front of him. He goes and confronts his boss, Mr. Deasy, who asks him about history. And Stephen says, history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to escape. You might be feeling the same way about the novel at this point. Chapter 3 is Proteus, where Stephen, much like myself in graduate school, wanders through a beautiful landscape, but thinks only about Aristotle in far too complicated thoughts to understand. Eventually he has a pee and writes the first lines of the back. Chapter 4 is Calypso, where we first meet Leopold Bloom. Bloom goes out and buys, even though we understand that he's Jewish, the first thing we see him do is to go out and buy a pork kidney for breakfast, which he then goes and burns on the stove while he's trying to talk to his wife about metempsychosis. Chapter 5 is Lotus Eaters, having burnt his breakfast and then, I left it out, famously taken a dump at the end of chapter 4. In chapter 5, Leopold Bloom goes and has a bath in the Lotus Eaters episode. It ends with Bloom contemplating his penis, languid, a floating flower, the father of thousands. Chapter 6 is Hades, where Bloom, having emptied his bowels and taken a bath, goes to a funeral with his frenemies, who spent half the time talking, when he's not around, talking about how all sorts of bad rumors about him. Chapter 7, it just slipped out of my mind, but it's Aeolus. 7 is Aeolus. We go back to Stephen Dedalus, who's in a newspaper office with a bunch of editors. There's a lot of windiness here, a lot of speech making. Stephen's reaction when they ask him what his speech is going to be tells a cryptic story about two nice little old ladies who wander to the top of Nelson's Pillar and spit plums out. This is the beginning of Stephen's life as a writer. Chapter 8 is Lastrygonians. We go back to Leopold Bloom. He's looking for a decent place to have lunch. He settles on a nice little decent pub called Davy Burns, where he has a Gorgonzola sandwich and a glass of Burgundy. Chapter 9 is Scylla and Charybdis. 100 yards away, Stephen Dedalus is talking about Shakespeare with a bunch of scholars. He doesn't know the theory of Shakespeare that he's expounding. He doesn't understand it or believe it himself. But eventually he leaves and crosses paths with Leopold Bloom at the very end. Chapter 10 is Wandering Rocks, this cinematic interlude in the middle where we have many people in Dublin crossing paths and crossing each other. Chapter 11 is Sirens, when we return to Bloom, who goes to have lunch in the Ormond Hotel, listens to music like the Sirens of Odysseus, ends up having lunch with a guy named Pat Goulding, and thinks of, meanwhile, in the background, the sound of his own bed is jingling with the sound of his wife having sex with another man. Chapter 12 is Cyclops, where Bloom goes to a pub and nearly gets into a big fight with a man who believes in all things Irish and Gaelic, escapes just in the nick of time like Elijah. Chapter 13, Nausicaa, Bloom, having confronted all these other enemies at the end of the day, finds himself on the beach, the same beach where Stephen was wandering in Proteus. He finds an attractive girl in the distance and masturbates while looking at her legs, while she, it turns out in turn, has been masturbating looking at him. At the end, and fireworks ensue. And Bloom, at the end, is left writing a message on the shore. Chapter 14, Oxen of the Sun, we go to a maternity hospital where Stephen and Bloom finally start to cross paths. But Stephen is... Where's the book?
30 seconds.
Chapter 15, big crazy play. Circe, big crazy play where Stephen gets into a fight in a brothel. As Ed was talking about before, he gets in a huge fight. Some British soldiers beat the crap out of him. Leopold Bloom picks him up and sends him on his way. 16, Eumaeus, probably the most boring chapter in the book, where Bloom and Stephen go to a cabinet shelter, get coffee. He starts to shape him up and tells an interesting story about his wife. Chapter 17 is Ithaca, the Great Question and Answer Catechism chapter. Bloom and Stephen return home. They have a peeing contest together. Infamously, or famously rather, Stephen decides not to stay at Eccles Street, but rather goes his own way. Bloom goes to bed. 18, Penelope. Molly Bloom answers every question and gives you the story that you all needed to know at the very end of the 18th episode of Ulysses. Yes.
Woo!
Woo!